In the frozen steppes of Mongolia, where winter winds cut through flesh like daggers and survival depends on strength alone, a child was born who would grow to become history's most feared conqueror. Temujin, later known as Genghis Khan, would forge an empire that stretched from the Pacific Ocean to Eastern Europe, not merely through military might, but through a calculated system of terror so sophisticated that entire civilizations would surrender at the mere whisper of his name. What made this nomadic warrior so terrifying wasn't just his army's speed or their deadly composite bows, but rather his mastery of psychological warfare and torture methods so brutal that they would haunt the collective memory of humanity for centuries. When Temujin was proclaimed Genghis Khan by the Mongol tribes in 1206, few could have predicted that his most potent weapons would not be forged from steel, but from fear itself. The great Khan understood a fundamental truth that would reshape the medieval world. Terror could accomplish what 1,000 arrows could not. His approach to conquest was methodical, calculated, and utterly ruthless. He didn't simply defeat enemies. He systematically broke their will to resist through techniques that pushed the boundaries of human cruelty. The Mongol Empire, at its height encompassing over 12 million square miles, was built upon a foundation of psychological terror that preceded their armies like a shadow across the Silk Road. Cities would surrender without siege, armies would flee without battle, and entire populations would abandon their homes rather than face the approaching storm. This wasn't accident or coincidence. This was the result of a carefully orchestrated campaign of brutality designed to maximize fear and minimize resistance. But what exactly were these methods that struck such terror into the hearts of medieval civilizations? How did a nomadic leader from the steppes develop torture techniques so effective that they would influence military strategy for generations? Today, we'll explore the dark machinery of Mongol psychological warfare, examining the specific methods that Genghis Khan employed to break not just bodies, but the very spirit of resistance itself. The systematic nature of Mongol brutality becomes clear when we examine their approach to conquest. This wasn't random violence or uncontrolled rage. Every act of cruelty served a strategic purpose. Every torture method was designed to send a message that would travel faster than their horses. The Khan understood that stories of horror could conquer cities more efficiently than siege engines, that whispered tales of unimaginable suffering could defeat armies before they ever took the field. The psychological sophistication of these methods reveals a mind that understood human nature with chilling clarity. Genghis Khan recognized that fear of death was less powerful than fear of how one might die. He crafted punishments that were not merely lethal, but designed to maximize suffering while serving as warnings to others. Each execution became a performance, each torture session a carefully choreographed message to potential enemies. What made these methods particularly terrifying was their systematic application across the vast expanse of the Mongol Empire. This wasn't the work of a single sadistic individual, but rather an institutionalized approach to terror that was taught, refined, and implemented by commanders across thousands of miles. The consistency of these brutal practices created a reputation that preceded the Mongol armies, often accomplishing conquest through reputation alone. The religious and cultural elements woven into these torture methods added another layer of psychological impact. The Mongols didn't simply kill their enemies, they violated the very foundations of their victims' beliefs about honor, dignity, and proper death. By understanding the religious and cultural values of their enemies, they could design punishments that would resonate with maximum psychological impact among the survivors who would spread these tales. Archaeological evidence and contemporary accounts reveal the industrial scale of Mongol brutality. These weren't isolated incidents or moments of battlefield fury, but systematic campaigns designed to eliminate not just military resistance, but the very possibility of future rebellion. The mathematical precision with which death was administered, the careful counting of victims, and the methodical documentation of destruction all point to a level of organization that was unprecedented in medieval warfare. The impact of these methods extended far beyond their immediate tactical value. They fundamentally altered how medieval societies understood warfare, diplomacy, and resistance. The mere possibility that Mongol forces might appear on the horizon was enough to reshape political calculations across Eurasia. Kings and emperors found themselves weighing the costs of resistance against the certain knowledge of what defeat would bring. Contemporary chroniclers struggled to find words adequate to describe what they witnessed. Muslim historians, Chinese scholars, and European observers all recorded accounts that push the boundaries of human comprehension. Their writings reveal not just the physical reality of Mongol torture methods, but the psychological impact on entire civilizations that suddenly found themselves confronting a form of warfare that seemed to emerge from their darkest nightmares. The technological innovations that supported these torture methods demonstrate the Mongol genius for adaptation and improvement. They didn't simply rely on traditional weapons or methods, but constantly refined and developed new techniques for maximizing psychological impact. From specially designed arrows that created terrifying sounds in flight to sophisticated execution devices that could process victims with industrial efficiency, the Mongols approached terror with the same innovative spirit they brought to military tactics. What emerges from historical records is a picture of systematic brutality that was both deeply personal and utterly impersonal. Individual victims faced tortures designed to maximize their personal suffering, while the broader campaign of terror operated with the cold efficiency of a machine designed to process resistance and convert it into submission. This duality, combining intimate cruelty with strategic calculation, created a form of warfare that was uniquely effective and uniquely terrifying. The legacy of these methods extended far beyond the Mongol Empire itself. Future conquerors would study and adapt Mongol techniques, while the societies that survived Mongol conquest would carry the psychological scars for generations. The very possibility that such methods might be employed again became a factor in diplomatic and military calculations long after the Mongol Empire had fragmented and declined. Understanding these methods requires us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the relationship between power and cruelty. The Mongols didn't invent torture or psychological warfare, but they refined these practices to a level of sophistication that remains disturbing even by modern standards. Their success demonstrates the terrible effectiveness of systematic terror when applied with intelligence, resources, and unwavering commitment. As we prepare to examine the specific techniques that made Genghis Khan's name synonymous with terror across 3 continents, we must remember that these methods were not the product of mindless savagery, but of calculated strategy implemented by one of history's most successful military minds. The horror of what we're about to explore lies not in its randomness, but in its deliberate precision. The architecture of Mongol terror began with a fundamental understanding that death itself was less frightening than the manner of dying. When Genghis Khan's forces approached the wealthy trading city of Otrar in 1218, they encountered a governor named Inalchuk, whose greed would become the catalyst for one of history's most symbolically brutal executions. Inalchuk had made a fatal miscalculation, seizing a Mongol trade caravan of 450 merchants and executing them all, claiming they were spies. The riches were sold in nearby markets, but the insult to Mongol honor would demand a response that would echo across the Islamic world. When Otrar finally fell after a brutal siege, Inalchuk was dragged before Genghis Khan alive. The governor, desperate to save his life, offered vast sums of gold and silver in exchange for mercy. But the Khan had already decided on a punishment that would serve as both personal retribution and strategic message. In a mockery of Inalchuk's greed for the caravan's wealth, Genghis Khan ordered molten silver to be poured into the governor's eyes and ears. The screams that emerged from that execution chamber would be remembered in Islamic chronicles for centuries, not merely as an act of revenge, but as a demonstration of what awaited those who dared to challenge Mongol authority. The symbolism was perfect in its cruelty. The very substance that Inalchuk had coveted became the instrument of his destruction. Contemporary accounts describe how the molten metal seared through his skull, the heat so intense that witnesses could smell burning flesh from across the courtyard. But this wasn't simply about killing one man. Every merchant, every governor, every ruler who heard this tale would understand that Mongol justice was both inevitable and unimaginably cruel. The psychological impact of such executions extended far beyond their immediate victims. News of Inalchuk's fate spread along the trade routes with the speed of wildfire, carried by terrified survivors who had witnessed the aftermath. The Khan understood that these stories would accomplish what armies could not, breaking the will to resist before his forces ever appeared on the horizon. This was warfare through narrative, conquest through reputation. But perhaps no torture method demonstrated Mongol psychological sophistication more clearly than their treatment of captured nobility. The Mongols operated under strict religious prohibitions against spilling the blood of nobles and royalty, believing that such acts would offend their sky god Tengri and defile the earth spirit Aj. This religious constraint, however, became the foundation for some of history's most ingenious and terrifying execution methods. The platform torture, employed after the Battle of the Khalkha River in 1223, represents the pinnacle of Mongol psychological warfare. When the Russian princes who had fought against General Subutai were captured, the Mongols constructed an enormous wooden platform over the defeated nobles. The princes were laid beneath this structure, conscious and aware of their fate, while Mongol commanders held a victory feast on top. As the celebration continued above them, the weight of the platform slowly crushed the life from their bodies. Imagine the horror of those final moments. The princes could hear the laughter of their executioners, the clinking of cups, the sounds of celebration literally crushing them to death. The psychological torture was as devastating as the physical agony. These men, who had ruled territories and commanded armies, were reduced to nothing more than the foundation for their enemy's banquet. The message was unmistakable. Mongol victory was so complete that former rulers became mere objects beneath their feet. The religious significance of this bloodless execution satisfied Mongol spiritual requirements while maximizing psychological impact. The victims' blood never touched the ground, technically honoring their noble status, but their deaths were prolonged and humiliating. This combination of religious observance and calculated cruelty created a unique form of terror that resonated across cultural boundaries. Contemporary Russian chronicles describe the sounds that emerged from beneath the platform as something that haunted survivors for the rest of their lives. The crushing of bones, the muffled screams, the gradual silence as life was slowly pressed from their bodies, all while the sounds of Mongol celebration continued above. This wasn't merely execution. It was a carefully orchestrated psychological assault designed to break not just the victims, but anyone who heard the tale. The Mongols refined these bloodless execution methods with scientific precision. Suffocation became an art form, with victims wrapped in wet animal hides that would shrink as they dried, slowly crushing their occupants. Drowning was elevated to psychological torture, with nobles wrapped in carpets before being thrown into rivers, ensuring their blood never touched the earth while maximizing their terror and suffering. The case of the Abbasid Caliph al-Mustasim in 1258 demonstrates how these methods evolved under Genghis Khan's successors. When Hulagu Khan conquered Baghdad, he ordered the caliph rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses. The religious leader of the Islamic world was reduced to nothing more than a rug beneath Mongol hooves, his blood contained within the fabric, while his death served as the ultimate symbol of Mongol dominance over Islamic civilization. These executions weren't random acts of cruelty, but carefully planned psychological operations. Each method was designed to maximize both the victim's suffering and the psychological impact on witnesses and future enemies. The Mongols understood that the manner of death could be more powerful than death itself, that the right execution could conquer territories without siege and break armies without battle. The industrial scale of Mongol terror reached its apex in the systematic destruction of entire cities. When the great trading center of Merv surrendered in 1221, the inhabitants believed they had saved their lives through submission. Instead, they had merely chosen the manner of their death. Tolui, son of Genghis Khan, sat on a golden throne as nearly 700,000 civilians were systematically executed over several days. The torture methods employed at Merv pushed the boundaries of human imagination. Wealthy citizens were subjected to prolonged torments designed to extract information about hidden treasures, but the torture continued long after any practical purpose had been served. Contemporary accounts describe citizens being set on fire, their screams echoing through the streets as Mongol soldiers methodically worked through assigned quotas of victims. Each soldier was reportedly required to execute between 300 and 400 people, turning murder into a bureaucratic process. The systematic nature of this slaughter, with quotas and assignments, demonstrates how the Mongols had transformed terror from an art into a science. Death became a manufacturing process, with efficiency measures and quality control implemented by commanders who understood that the manner of killing was as important as the killing itself. The psychological impact of these mass executions extended far beyond their immediate victims. Survivors were deliberately spared, not from mercy, but to serve as witnesses who would carry tales of Mongol brutality to other cities. These human messengers became weapons of psychological warfare, their testimony more effective than any siege engine in breaking the will of potential resistors. The counting of the dead through mutilation added another layer of psychological horror to Mongol conquest. After the Battle of Legnica in 1241, Mongol forces cut the right ear from every enemy corpse, filling 9 large sacks with these grisly trophies. This practice served multiple purposes. It provided accurate casualty counts, created portable evidence of victory, and demonstrated the systematic nature of Mongol efficiency in processing death. The macabre accounting of severed ears reveals the industrial mindset that underpinned Mongol warfare. These weren't trophies taken in the heat of battle, but carefully collected evidence of systematic destruction. The image of Mongol soldiers methodically working through battlefields, knife in hand, separating ears from corpses like harvesters collecting grain, demonstrates how terror had become a precise science under Genghis Khan's command. The psychological warfare extended beyond the battlefield into the realm of cultural destruction. When the Mongols conquered the Great Library of Bukhara in 1220, they didn't simply burn the books. They forced the city's scholars to watch as centuries of accumulated knowledge was fed to horses and used as bedding for Mongol animals. The humiliation of seeing their life's work reduced to stable fodder was more devastating than any physical torture. These learned men, who had devoted their lives to preserving knowledge, were forced to witness the systematic destruction of everything they held sacred. The environmental warfare tactics employed by Mongol forces demonstrated their understanding that destroying a civilization's foundation was more effective than simply killing its people. During campaigns in northern China, they systematically poisoned wells with rotting corpses, creating what Chinese chronicles called the Black Death of Water. Entire regions became uninhabitable, forcing populations to flee or die of thirst. This wasn't random destruction, but calculated genocide through environmental manipulation. The sophistication of Mongol psychological operations becomes clear when examining their use of human shields during sieges. Captured civilians weren't simply killed, but were forced to march ahead of Mongol forces, creating impossible moral dilemmas for defenders. How could a city's guardians fire upon their own people? Yet allowing the Mongols to advance meant certain destruction. This tactical innovation turned compassion into a weapon, using humanity's basic instincts against itself. The legacy of these methods extended far beyond the Mongol Empire's borders. The very possibility that such techniques might be employed again became a factor in diplomatic calculations for centuries. Kings and emperors found themselves weighing the costs of resistance against the certain knowledge of what defeat would bring. The shadow of Mongol terror had fundamentally altered the calculus of medieval warfare. As we close this examination of history's most systematic campaign of terror, we must confront the uncomfortable truth that these methods were devastatingly effective. Genghis Khan's empire became the largest contiguous land empire in human history, not despite these brutal tactics, but because of them. His understanding of human psychology, combined with an unwavering commitment to systematic cruelty, created a form of warfare that conquered through fear as much as force. The echoes of these methods can still be felt today in military strategy and psychological operations. The principle that the manner of victory matters as much as victory itself remains relevant in modern conflict. Genghis Khan's true genius lay not in his ability to kill, but in his understanding that the right death could prevent 1,000 battles. In the end, the great Khan's most terrifying weapon wasn't his cavalry or his composite bows, but his mastery of the human psyche. He understood that fear could travel faster than horses, that stories of horror could conquer cities more efficiently than siege engines, and that the right torture could break not just bodies, but the very spirit of resistance itself. This dark knowledge, refined on the steppes of Mongolia and perfected across 3 continents, remains one of history's most chilling demonstrations of what humans are capable of when cruelty becomes science.